folks, and welcome to Film Optimist, where we talk about all things film with a healthy dose of optimism. I'm your co-host, Seth Boyd.
And I am Megan Tierney, and we are coming in again, folks, with another interview today with the director, producer, co-editor, which is very exciting for us. Our first big boy and girl interview of the film Four Wheel Bob. And this is a former professor of yours, Seth, with Mr. Tal Skloot.
Yes, he taught foreign film, and he taught many classes, but I took intro to foreign film for him in college, and he's classes where I actually saw Picnic at Hanging Rock for the first time. So It all ties back in together. So he's a Bay Area filmmaker who's been an editor on over 20 movies. He's directed a couple documentaries, and in 2016, he released the film we're about to talk about, Four Wheel Bob, which follows Bob Cromer, a man who's been bound for a wheelchair for most of his life, but is still an avid hiker. And this follows his attempts to go through a very long trail in the Sierra Nevadas, a very rocky trail that, as one can imagine. He's the first and only person to attempt this in a wheelchair. I believe there's a few mountains he has actually climbed fully in a wheelchair. So he's a record holder, a very interesting guy. And Tal was filming him for a few years. So I had seen the film years ago, but I didn't know too much of the background behind it and the process. So this was very insightful for me.
We so enjoyed our interview with Tal, and without further ado, we hope that you enjoy it too. Here's our interview with Tal Skloot.
Folks, we are welcomed by director Tal Skloot, has graced us with his presence on the podcast. He was actually a professor of mine in community college who introduced me to so many wonderful films, including ones we talked about, like Picnic at Hanging Rock. And he's directed a couple documentaries, he's edited many movies, and we're talking today about his 2016 documentary, Four Wheel Bob, about a real life story of a man named Bob Cromer who attempts to traverse a mountainous pass while being bound to a wheelchair. So, Tal, thank you for joining us.
For sure. Yeah.
I will say that there's so many questions that come to mind, but the first one on rewatching this movie, what inspired that opening shot, the shot with the camera at the angle of like the wheels?
Yeah, great question. I think I wanted to start, actually a fellow filmmaker of mine said, when we were doing that shoot, said, you've got to get a camera that sort of has something resembling his perspective, and it won't be exact, and but something to give the audience a sense of you're with him, you're sort of experiencing his journey. And I thought, well, yeah, I think that's important too. And I think that angle, a really low angle right at the rocks that you first open with, really gives you a sense of sort of his most intimate challenge, going over just one single rock, or So I think that was the idea, to sort of throw the audience immediately into his struggle up that mountain. Yeah,
I think it definitely works that way. It's very effective, and it's visually very cool. But I think you do see that little pebble is hard to get the wheelchair over. And it's what struck out to me, and I did remember that shot for the first time seeing it at the Green Film Festival years ago. This is an angle we've seen, I think, pretty commonly with a car, right? We've seen the car wheels, but I think Breaking Bad would kind of go to that a lot with their stock footage. But so it was just seeing that same shot with a completely different vehicle, not on the road, was very fascinating to me, and just a completely different context for it. So it was a fantastic way to open it.
Thanks.
With that in mind, on the note of craft, was there any films or filmmakers you are consciously drawing from while you were planning to shoot?
Wow, great question. Well, in terms of documentaries, I was really influenced by this film called Murder Ball. I don't know if you've seen it, but have you seen that film?
Is that about the wheelchair-bound teen? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And they
Is it
play
basketball?
It's a kind of a basketball
of
people in wheelchair, and it came out, I forget, maybe 15 years ago. It was about, overcoming your struggles, but also really about overcoming personal challenges of each of these characters. And they had amazing sort of same thing you're talking about, Dukes of Hazzard, Breaking Bad, visceral footage of these guys, anything but what you'd imagine a handicapped person could do. So I was largely influenced, I think, by that visually, but otherwise, I was partially influenced by literature, I think, for Bob's struggle. In part, if you think of, some of like Sisyphus, for example,
Sure.
trying to roll the rock up the hill, or other Greek figures who have, sort of had the hero's journey and tried to overcome that. So I sort of read the Odyssey again and did a little more research, strangely, into Greek literature,
Sure.
and thought, well, this is sort of really a universal story, this idea of overcoming, your largest obstacle. And I think the drone, we have some drone footage in there, and I think this idea again of giving a perspective of the vastness of what he's going through was interesting. So thinking about the macro, but also the micro, thinking of both. So.
Wow. I love you said that, Professor. Bob is amazing in this, and I love his unrelenting optimism throughout it all. But then also I love that what was included was also how frustrating this journey is, and how just how cumbersome, how tiring it is. That was really powerful as well. I mean, he's such an optimistic guy, but it's like, obviously it comes with its struggle. So I really liked that like duality of his journey and his story. That was really well done for me.
Excellent. Thank you.
Absolutely. Because he seems to certainly have a sense of humor, and he's every time someone's kind of waiting patiently to go behind him, he has some quip of this time you're here to clear out the rocks or something like that. He's very funny. I think people were, it seemed those people were very taken aback by everything they were witnessing, of not only was this guy here, but he's cracking surprisingly great jokes. But we do have those moments where he is really struggling, particularly with his insulin on that first attempt. So I think we really get a full, deep look at Bob in this movie. Yeah. How did Bob react when you approached him?
Well, he was very cool. I just kind of hung out with him. I saw a picture, I think, in the Chronicle. He'd had, coverage before and had been on the news, and so this was, his first time with media. And I just kind of approached him and said, I think this was before he was going to do Kearsarge Pass, which was the big Sierra journey in the film that he does a few times. And I said, can we get together and hang out? And, sort of my approach to filmmaking is always very informal. Like, I think if your subject isn't comfortable with you and you're not comfortable with the subject, it's not going to work. It can't be, it can't be a very formal thing. So we hung out before we ever shot anything and just sort of got to know each other. And I also, like you said, had this impression of this, I didn't know what to expect, but this very funny guy and this very optimistic guy in the face of everything, and almost like his handicap was almost an aside, like, oh yeah, I happen to be in a wheelchair too, but I'm full of life. So that was the real, point at which I thought, I think this guy's interesting, an interesting character, and the duality, in the sense of his internal struggle of knowing he's, disabled, has challenges in the world, and yet, he never seems to, at least on the outside, let it get him down, So anyway, I found that interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you definitely explore that. Was there any pushback or concern from his family or his friends when you are approaching him?
Yeah, for sure. So his wife, for example, who's a lovely person, Gina, I thought, she needs to be part of this story. She's his most intimate partner. She cares for him. She's, but she just refused to be on camera. So she said, this is his story. You can film him. And anyway, but, me being the stubborn filmmaker that I am, I kept pursuing her and telling her, no, the more I got into the story, I thought, you guys are very connected and have, you in so many ways, emotionally and, physically. And so I think, we spent about a total of maybe about 5 years all told filming.
Oh, wow.
And
wow.
Yeah, because you only see little sections. I mean, there's 100 hours of footage you don't see, right? And I think by year like 2.5 or 3, she finally agreed to be interviewed. So
That's
But
awesome.
yeah, but that said, most of his, you know, I interview his daughter and her family, and they were happy to be interviewed. So I think once again, I spent a little time with Bob, and he saw I was just really interested in telling his story. Then things kind of loosened up eventually.
Wow. You know, the hiking scenes are amazing. I mean, Bob is just obviously this incredible athlete, but seeing him get up those mountains was really a like tension-filled moment for me, and the scrunch and crunch of that chair just getting up the mountain for me was just really did a lot, and I was kind of waiting on bated breath like watching it. So as a filmmaker for it, I was wondering about how hands-off were you during these hikes, and it does come off very like true documentary style. Bob is the subject, you know, camera's gone kind of thing, is the idea. So was that the case?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. That was the case.
Wow.
And I pretty much, you know, well, so we were a bit of a crew. It wasn't like we were invisible. We had, you know, 2 camera operators, a drone. We actually had a still photographer that Getty Images sent out to do a you know, a photo essay about him. So he was along. So, you know, while it looks like Bob's in nature, he actually has this gaggle of people around him. But, you know, I did want it to be Bob doing his thing up there. And I think Bob very much wanted that also. He didn't want any assistance. I think in our first trip and earlier times when we'd gone hiking, you know, I'd say, hey, Bob, can I grab your backpack or, you know, give you a push here? And very early on, I got the feeling that no, you know, if I can't do it, I don't want any help. This is my journey very much and my challenge. So I quickly got, you know, the picture that completely hands off, you know, if he can't do it, then he'll find a way to do it. So, and other people along the hikes also, you know, everyone kind of like, I mean, the funny part is, you don't see it in the film, but just about every, you know, 2 minutes, someone is stopping to chat with them. And, you know, so we're making these incremental, even more so than his, it's like, everyone's like, I want to talk with Bob. But many people, you know, often you would offer and say, and he, you know, he was pretty much, no, I mean, he let us, at some point, he realized his backpack, which was also loaded, you know, 40-pound backpack, was really slowing him down, especially in the second ascent. So I said, look, we're just going to take, we were also carrying full gear of backpack and filming. And our way was to shuttle things up like 1/4 mile and run back down and film. So I said, why don't we just, we're going to shuttle our stuff up there. Let us at least take your backpack. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, cool. But, and, you know, and sort of the final scene in the film, people have asked in the past, he comes across a giant rock fall that's insurmountable for him. And, you know, people often ask, gosh, you know, why couldn't, he could have just made it across if you carried him, if there was some assistance. In that point in particular, where it was clear that he couldn't surpass those rocks. And we had a discussion at that point that's, you know, not on camera, but I definitely said, hey, Bob, we'll get, you know, we had some pack horses on that second trip. We can get them to carry your stuff. We'll carry you across. And again, it was very clear that, hey, if I can't do it on my own, you know, for my own volition, I don't want to do it. So anyway, long answer, but
it certainly reminds me of a Herzog movie, just this man taking on this Fitzcarraldo or something, this seemingly impossible task, although he's a much better person than your average Herzog hero. But I really love that much in the same way that he doesn't really get his opera. Fitzcarraldo, Bob stops, and I should note how I think I understand. I think the version I saw was 72 minutes at the Green Film Festival, and the versions online right now are 54 minutes. So that's the versions Megan's seen I've seen most recently. So if we missed something, our apologies. But I think the movie, if I recall at the festival, Bob was maybe talking about trying this again. Has he? And is that, if he does, is that something you'll try to film if he attempts it?
Yeah, I think Bob, I don't want to say he won't, but I think right now he's struggled quite a bit with his diabetes. He's gotten older,
Right.
and also he's waiting for a transplant of his, some of his liver, I think it is sort of failing. And so he's, physically not in the same shape he was when we made that movie. So still gets out and goes about, but I don't see him doing Kearsarge until some of his health issues are solved, at least.
Fair enough. You really get a great bittersweet feeling about him. You get the sense he's still proud of himself for trying it, and he should be. He's not wrong. I'm trying to remember his line exactly. Like, I didn't fail. It's amazing I did this, and I think that's something you must have been conscious of in the editing. Is there's a shot of him very early on saying, if I only make it to here, that's great, because look at the view I have. And sometimes I only make it to here, and I appreciate that not only the story is told with this being set up very early on, but rewatching this, year of our Lord 2022, we've been having Corona for a while. The idea of the goalpost being moved much closer is a very understandable, relatable thing. And a lot of this movie, I think I viewed at least very different, with just the focus on going out, the focus on trying. And also, there's a scene of him trying to get a job and the struggles that has. These are all relatable things that I think a lot of people are thinking about differently. And I'm wondering if you found the movies related to a new audience, especially since it was uploaded on YouTube September of last year, if people are responding to it in that light.
Yeah, that's really an excellent question. I don't know per se, but I think everything you say is true. And my hope is that some of these ideas, in a sense, what you're alluding to, are universal, right? And there's certainly people online. Yes, it's on this Real Stories on YouTube now. And looking at the comments, some are from people with disabilities, but I think some have responded in ways you've said. I've been cooped up in my house. This has given me inspiration to go out and hike and try and get healthy. And so I think there is an element of that. I was hoping, and I think it's the case, that some of the universal truths about what we all struggle with are in that movie that Bob touches on. And I think that idea of, hey, if you can just get out of the house and go around the block, fantastic. If you can hike for a quarter of a mile, if you can go and just see your family, whatever it is, that is your personal, your way to make yourself healthier and give yourself a little hope. Yeah,
I think those truths are definitely there, but you were a bit of an outdoorsman as well. So how important was that element of the story to you? Not just this is a man achieving something great, but this is a man hiking, despite a physical thing. Was the health, or just the idea of environmentalism is one of those particularly element that drew you to the story?
Yeah, these are really great questions, you guys. Absolutely, yeah. I think the environmental side is a little hidden in thematically, but that was really important to me, and actually really important to Bob. There are parts in the film where he's talking about looking at the chickadees or this particular leaf, talking to a group of disabled people about what kind of ducks they're seeing or what kind of animals are out there in nature. And and I'm a nature lover, and I love going out into nature. And I think, again, that healing quality of getting out of our house and being out there is really important to Bob, and has always been. He's led these tours with kids on nature hikes and done so in East Bay Park and elsewhere. So I think that's an important part of it. We showed, when it was in festivals, it showed, as you said, the San Francisco Green Festival and a number of other environmental festivals. And I think, they got the drift that, hey, this is an important sub-theme, though not a main theme in the film.
Right, absolutely.
I love seeing the Bay Area on film, and me and Seth being from the Bay Area, you always see San Francisco or Oakland, the cityscapes, but not as much as our beautiful backyard that we have to us. So that was a real, quite a treat for me. It really was. And then to think about access as well, like I believe Bob talked about, doing certain things can open up so much access for people that we don't even think about sometimes, or it just gets lost to the wayside. And we are so privileged to enjoy the beautiful outdoors, and it's like, yes, I appreciate his reminder that, you know, this can be for everybody if we do certain things here and there. And that was great. I was also particularly struck by how the default for people specifically in wheelchairs would likely be to be in a indoors environment because of just their capabilities in the chair, which obviously Bob proves differently and wrong throughout the film, and that's the, you know, his story. But I appreciate and was struck by how he was just mentioning that these things are issues and constricting for people who are experiencing this. So it was such a good reminder for someone like me to have.
Yeah, I think, thanks for saying that. And I think that's an important point too. You know, when we were working on the film and then we showed it at these abilities expos, which are these national expos around the country for people with disabilities, and we showed it at some other events that dealt with healthcare. And that theme kept coming back. I think it's very astute of you to understand that, is that the health of people with disabilities really has to do with their outlook as much, you know, and part of their outlook is, yes, doing things that are proactive. And I think, you know, I talked to some healthcare providers, and one woman said, we try to get people with disabilities out of their shoes, touching the earth, because we're finding that grounding with earth is helping people in a sense, right? Interesting stuff, right? And it's like things you wouldn't, at least I hadn't, as, you know, layperson, thought about. But yeah, it became clear that there are ways to really do, I guess, they're holistic things that you can do rather than take meds to get healthy out there, you know.
Right.
Just one more point, in the East Bay Parks and our area here, I'm super delighted because I go out and hike all the time, as you guys do, and to show the world, and you know, now some of our lovely areas that, you know, and just the East Bay Park District happens to be the largest regional park district in the United States.
Oh my gosh.
I did not realize that.
Yeah. So it's like, hey, let's show that. Anyway. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And yeah, fully agree, Megan. It's great to see the rolling hills that I certainly miss in the walking. I was rewatching this, was a lot of, oh man, the green.
I know.
So beautiful there. I do love my new city, but man, it's so beautiful there. And on this note, I don't remember what trail he's talking about in Livermore. It says there's a really small stretch that would not take very long or be very costly to pave over. That means it's a lot more accessible to the average person in a wheelchair, averages in not doing mountain climbing like Bob is doing, who might have a real struggle, who might get knocked out of their chair. And on the note of the kind of political implications of this movie too, I really like you have him get into something that simple of a solution, and how many problems could happen that someone's not thinking of because it doesn't affect them directly. And so I think there's a lot of moments like this in this movie that do open up the viewer's mind to a lot of other things, you know, about, well, if it's that easy, why haven't we done it? You know, and hopefully that part did get paved over. I'm not sure, but I do really love those kind of city council meeting scenes of him, and it seemed that the people in the East Bay Parks Committee were pretty eager to sing Bob's praises in the movie. Is that my assumption, or is that your experience in interviewing people there?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, for example, that's another great observation. You know, the East Bay Parks, and I'm sure other parks, have large initiatives. In fact, he's on the committee advising what trails can you fix. You can't go paving stuff in the Sierras, but you know, what trails are local that you can fix, and just that idea of I think that's another area that's very important to get, you know, advocacy. And to figure out, you know, how can we make certain areas accessible? And it doesn't take a lot of work. It takes just a little bit of planning and, of course, a little bit of money, but that opens up those worlds to people, right? So, yeah, I think I eventually, Bob comes across as a sort of nice, you know, uncle type you'd like to know on the one hand. But I think the interesting part for me is he does have layers of complexity and intent that hopefully come forward. And he's got an agenda of how to try to make the world better for people in general too.
Right. And I think that's part of what was so great about this movie is he said, despite doing this, he doesn't have a singular task in mind. While he's giving himself these personal challenges that are inspiring, he is such a community focused person as well. That seems to be maybe even a bigger focus of his time throughout the year is on these committees. And we had a lot of great footage of him speaking at rallies, like you said, giving the tours for kids and being such an active member of the community in a way that, again, talking about, in a pandemic world, I think a lot of people realized out of necessity that you maybe have to get involved in your community for various reasons. And this movie, I don't want to say made it look like you could just go down to City Hall and get things done, but it made it seem approachable, and I think that's a very important thing. I'm just thinking again, Oakland, how many restaurants were surprised about how easy it was to be able to get a parklet built outside. And now some of those streets are not streets. And that's right. I think, great. People are walking and biking and there's restaurants, and that happened pretty often. But, a lot of that was the conditions of the day, but a lot of that was actually, it wasn't as hard as we thought it would be to go in and get something done and to work with the city, and who knew? So this movie definitely, I think, plants a lot of important seeds for change. That, like you said, it's much, they're subtle. It's a story about a man climbing a mountain, but there's really great political implications throughout the film. Sorry, not a question, just singing your praises.
No, I agree. And, I was thinking the same thing, like Europe has figured it out, how to make pedestrian streets and open restaurants for people. And I guess it took a pandemic for us to sort of start getting on board and designing that kind of, I really hope that carries forward somehow, that, that idea. I mean, talk about accessibility. If you can roll down the street and, eat at an outdoor cafe and, anyway. But
no, absolutely. I think we've kind of touched on this one with the scenes on the mountain, but beyond what's already been discussed, was there any surprising practical difficulties that came up in shooting?
Yeah, quite a, you
were shooting for 5 years, so.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I think probably the hardest couple of moments, probably the hardest moment, of course, as you can imagine, was where Bob declares defeat or not able to do it for the, after going up for the second time. And there were a number of things that happened at that moment. Somewhere in the film, you sort of see him going down the hill, and he's pretty defeated, and that's not something I'd seen in Bob very often. He really, he had geared up. This was his second time trying to make this. And, he makes a good case for why he needs to not carry on for health reasons, right? And it was pretty dangerous with his blood level and other elements going on. But we continued to roll the cameras, and it was just a little heartbreaking. Not in the film per se, but personally, after he got down the hill, he was pretty out of it and shaky. And I realized later his blood sugar and insulin level was incredibly low. A little backstory is that we had intended, and he had intended to have a medic, a fireman friend of his who certified in healthcare and emergency stuff, come with us. And he was a hiker who was going to come with us on these hikes. Anyway, he got called off to fire and couldn't be there. And he was supposed to be there to monitor Bob, because we were a camera crew, we were working, and we had no idea how to do that.
Sure.
So long story short, and there's a card in the film that says he was, after the second ascent, was hospitalized. And that was a little hard as a filmmaker. Like, I didn't realize quite how sick he was and how he really should have had medical attention. And I've always felt, responsible for that. That's sort of the ethics area. I probably couldn't have known, but he was in a hotel room alone that night, and might not have survived if things were slightly worse.
Wow.
And it wasn't until we got him to the doctor and they rushed him into emergency, and he was in critical care for 5 days. And we were, oh yeah, this is pretty freaking serious.
that must have lay heavy on you, especially at the time. But thank God Bob was okay.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But these are sometimes as filmmakers, you run into these moments where it's tough. So that was anyway one of the tougher moments for us, I think.
How long after he was rushed? He was in the hospital for a few days. Were you able to reconnect to him? Kind of. I imagine Bob was hoping this film would conclude with him traversing the past. So, like, what was the process of realizing, well, what are we going to do to wrap this up instead?
Yeah, well, so Bob recovered, and it was clear after that he wasn't going to make another third attempt anytime soon. His doctor had said pretty much, okay, you need to chill now for a year and get your body healthy. As a filmmaker, I sort of had an existential problem with the film, which was it had no ending,
Yeah.
And so I struggled with that and was kind of bummed for a while, thinking, oh, I did all 5 years of shooting and don't really have a movie, until I realized that we did some interviews afterwards that you see at the end of the film. And I think it became clear to me that it didn't have to be a success in the typical sense of the word. And as Bob, states, his just doing it was a success for him, in his own way, and showing that he could make these attempts. And in a sense, I think ultimately maybe that was even more poignant than, sort of being at the top of this mountain and planting your flag or whatever, that I came to realize, this is a poignant thing he has to say about his experience. And so it actually worked out, I think.
I would certainly agree. I really love the ending of the film. I think it is more inspiring, to be honest. Frankly, a lot more people can try than can succeed at something that, and I don't think, going back to Sisyphus, I don't think we should have the end goal be our only measure of success.
Yeah.
Yes.
To Bob's optimism, I think it's just like the simple message of like, keep going, like just keep, you can keep going through these things, and it'll take you to some amazing places. And I love the ending shot as well. It's how beautiful.
Yes, I agree.
We only have a few minutes left here. So one last question. Us calling ourselves Film Optimists, we like to recommend movies. Is there anything you've seen recently, doesn't have to be a new release, that you would just like to plug on a podcast, tell people they should go out and see, other than, of course, your movie, which we'll be telling people to go see?
So current films that are...
It doesn't have to be current. It can be anything from any time in film history you just you'd like to recommend.
Okay. Well, completely out of left field, but it's a comedy called Plus One.
Okay.
Which was a great comedy that came out in the 90s that I just saw for the first time a couple of weeks ago. And it's a wonderfully smart comedy. I don't know, maybe it's because of during the pandemic, we tried to watch lighter stuff, and I was always looking for, and this is just a wonderfully overlooked comedy that no one has heard about two friends in their 20s who go to a lot of weddings and like decide to just like be each other's plus one and go to these things because they're so damn depressing, and support each other through having to go to all their friends getting married. Anyway, Plus
that
One.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. We always love to draw attention to a hidden gem like that.
Yes.
So perfect.
Yeah.
Good. Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. People can find this on YouTube and Canopy. And I think those are the main places that's available to watch. But is there any other thing for you specifically you would like us to plug or promote?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, if they want to check out the film, that'd be great. And I got to tell you guys, your questions were, I've done a few of these, are very insightful and thoughtful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for researching and thinking carefully about these questions.
I really appreciate that. This is my first interview with this. I think your first interview, Megan. So
you should do some more.
I hope we can get some other filmmakers on here. That'd be great.
It'd be great. Yeah. Thank you for this film, Professor. It was a pleasure to watch.
Absolutely.
And thank you for this interview. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, same here. Thanks a lot, you guys.